Two names, one chamber, and a nation holding its breath. Jasmine Crockett and Melania Trump face off under the blinding lights of Congress as 17 million eyes lock onto every word. Two sentences will split the room, two philosophies will collide, and the air itself feels ready to shatter. When silence becomes as dangerous as noise, which side will America choose? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Capitol hearing room was lit like a battlefield. White studio lights cutting down on polished desks, cameras staring from every angle. There was no audience, only millions watching live through the broadcast, every second broadcast, like a trial for the nation. The official banner read, "Standards of Public Power and the Limits of Symbolic Authority." But no one in that room believed it was just theory. It was a showdown. At one table sat Jasmine Crockett, young, sharp-eyed, the kind of lawmaker who had built her name on refusing to bite her tongue. Papers in a red folder lay untouched before her, but everyone could sense they weren't just notes, they were weapons. Across from her, Melania Trump appeared like marble in motion, perfectly composed, the silence around her almost louder than words. She hadn't faced a panel in years, and her sudden presence today was enough to rattle the chamber. On the surface, civility ruled, polite smiles, nods, steady hands folded on the table. But underneath the tension was thick enough to choke. Two worlds were colliding in real time, Melania embodying silence as ritual, and Jasmine carrying speaking out as duty. The stage was set, and the air itself felt ready to split. The stage was set. Now the first question hit like a gavel to the ribs. The moderator leaned into the mic and asked plain and direct what role silence should play in politics. Eyes shifted to Melania first because her quiet was already a presence in the room. She didn't hurry, didn't fidget, just let the spotlight breathe for a beat. Then she said, "Strength is not loud." The line fell clean like glass set on marble, and the chamber seemed to tighten around the words. She kept her tone even almost soothing, as if guiding the room back to manners by sheer poise. She spoke about restraint, about how leaders carry storms without turning them into thunder. She avoided names, avoided blame, and drew a bright, careful circle around her own seat at the table. "I can only speak for myself," she said, and it sounded less like a dodge than a rule she lived by. Her face gave nothing away. The performance was control, and control was the message. The moderator pivoted to Jasmine, and the camera caught the spark in her eyes before she spoke. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. She aimed it like a spotlight instead of a siren. "Sometimes noise is the only thing people hear after being ignored too long," Jasmine said, and the sentence landed with the weight of a door finally opening. She talked about neighborhoods that only get attention when something breaks, and families who learn that peace without justice feels like being erased quietly. She didn't let the room look away from what silence can cost when it comes from the top down. Back and forth they went, never slipping into shouting, never letting the temperature cool either. Melania kept returning to tone, to the grace of measured speech, to the damage a single reckless word can do. Jasmine countered with the harm of 1,000 days, without one necessary word, the slow bruising that no one photographs. Each sentence carried personal fingerprints, even when neither woman said you. Everyone could hear the subtext anyway. The moderator watched the clock like a lifeguard scanning a rip current. Melania's answers stayed polished, and the polish itself became a kind of shield. When asked whether the White House had stoked division, she didn't step into the crossfire. She stepped back behind the same boundary, "I can only speak for myself." You could feel the finesse, how she separated presence from responsibility, how she made silence sound like stewardship. But the left side of the room shifted in their chairs, sensing the way the point kept sliding off the plate. Jasmine's pen rested on her notes untouched, as if the words she needed were already memorized in scar tissue. Then came the cleanest cut of the hour, delivered without a tremor. Jasmine looked into the camera, then back to the dais and said, "Silence is a reaction too." The microphone didn't need to work hard. The room did it for her. Polite smiles held, but a couple of jaws set a little tighter, and even the moderator's nod slowed by half a beat. The line didn't accuse anyone by name. It accused a habit, a pattern, a comfort that had been wearing a gentleman's coat. Melania kept her gaze steady, and for a second the two philosophies hung there, like twin blades, bright and motionless. Heat built under the skin of the hearing, but the veneer stayed glossy. Water poured into glasses, hands folded every sentence dressed for church. The moderator shifted to closing remarks for the round, his voice, trying to lower the heartbeat without flattening the stakes. Questions hovered in the air, like drones filming a battlefield that hadn't exploded, but might at any second. You could hear paper whispering as staffers adjusted binders, the small sounds that get loud when everyone is bracing. The cameras didn't blink. Neither did the country. Seeing the red lights hold steady, the moderator finally carved a seam into the tension. He thanked both witnesses, praised the constructive tone, and announced a brief recess to reset equipment and switch feeds. Chairs scraped softly, but nobody exhaled all the way. It felt like pausing a movie one frame before the car hits the wall. He tapped the gavel once more, gentle but final, and the echo folded into the ceiling. The break was only a few minutes, yet you could feel the whole room standing on its toes inside those minutes, waiting to see which way the air would turn next. The recess arrived, but the room still felt wound tight. Overhead, the studio lights dimmed to a dusk that left edges sharp and faces pale. The red tally lights on the cameras clicked off, yet the lenses kept pointing like watchful eyes. Staff drifted in quiet patterns, swapping water, clearing cups pretending this was a normal break. The moderator whispered with a clerk, heads close, pens tapping. On the table between the two women, the microphone sat like small black stones, patient and open. Melania leaned a fraction toward Jasmine, deliberate as a chess move, and let her voice slide under the air. "You should be careful who you call out. Some of us never forget." The words were soft, but cut with the neatness of a new blade. She kept her eyes forward, not gifting even a glance, as if the line belonged to the room and not its target. A cameraman coughed somewhere near the wall, then stilled, unsure if he had heard what he thought he heard. The light on the far audio rack glowed a quiet amber, a small heartbeat in a forest of cables. Jasmine did not blink. She angled her chin a notch and answered in the same calm the broadcast demanded. "That's supposed to scare me." The question hung there, level and steady like a ruler laid against an uneven surface. A producer paused mid-step, reading the air the way sailors read clouds, and backed out of frame without a sound. Paper breathed on the desks. The building's vent hummed. The silence between sentences turned into a second stage. Melania's mouth curled by a millimeter, the ghost of a smile that revealed nothing and suggested everything. "I am not threatening. I am reminding." She let the final words sit there like a pushpin, as if the map of the room needed to be held in place. Jasmine's reply arrived without hurry, each syllable clipped clean. "I was elected to remind what others try to forget." The counterpoint was precise, and the space between the two sentences felt suddenly shorter than the table. The cameras idled like parked cars, but the mics did not sleep. Under the desk, tiny LEDs held their glow, and on a side monitor, a thin green bar kept twitching with every breath. No one in the room announced it, yet the system was still listening, dutiful, hungry, exact. The private moment wasn't private at all. It was only quieter. In the control booth, a headset hung on a chair, its ear cups catching the low murmur and translating it into little walls of sound. The red light above Channel 1 never actually slept. Jasmine kept her gaze level, not at Melania, but through the air between them, as if the words themselves were the thing to face. Melania adjusted a pen so it lay perfectly parallel to the table edge, the careful geometry of someone who never wastes movement. Around them, the set breathed, a cable settled, a vent clicked, the faint tick of a cooling lamp marked seconds like a metronome. The exchange had been a whisper, dual blades wrapped in velvet, but the room carried every note. And somewhere inside the building's ribs, the circuitry stored it all, with machine patience and invisible witness that never blinks. Every syllable found tape waiting for the next cue. A low tone pulsed on the meter, then settled, a tiny flick that meant the line was alive. Nobody announced it. Nobody had to, because the room's posture said everything: backs, straighter breaths, measured eyes forward. Melania's hair caught a thin blade of light, and for a heartbeat she looked like a statue, given a single private thought. Jasmine touched the red folder with 2 fingers, not to open it, but to anchor herself to something solid that was not the table or the cameras. Between them, the microphones waited neutral and exact, taking in the vowels, the pauses, the softness that made the edges sharper. The break held steady, a bubble that refused to pop. And all the while, the system kept listening, writing the moment down in waves and numbers, as if the building itself had leaned in to hear. The break popped like a bubble, the red lights blinked back to life, and the room locked into formation. The moderator thanked them for the constructive exchange and invited closing thoughts for the round voice, steady eyes alert. Melania lifted her chin a notch, collected and precise, and let the words land one by one. Respect begins by knowing when to lower the volume. The sentence was soft measured, the kind of line that sounds like a rule your grandmother would approve. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer, bracing for the answer waiting across the table. Jasmine didn't rush to speak. She reached for the red folder and flipped it open, just far enough to reveal a single sheet. In the center, in bold black type, the message hit like a flare. Kindness is not silence in the face of injustice. Gasps didn't break out, but the air changed shape like a door opening onto cold night. A staffer stilled in mid-step, as if the floor might give under her next move. The moderator's pen stopped scratching, hovering above paper like a stalled second hand. The release was silent but violent, a wave of held emotion suddenly given a lane. Melania's posture didn't shift, but the muscles along her jaw found a quieter gear, and the angle of her eyes sharpened by a degree. She returned to principle, to caution, to the cost of imprecision when millions are watching. A single wrong word can do harm. It was not a dodge. It was a doctrine, and she wore it like armor you polish every night. Jasmine met doctrine with lived memory, the kind that doesn't need adjectives to sting. She kept her tone even, hand still, and sent the counterpoint across the table like a clean throw. 1,000 days of silence do more harm than one word at the right time. The sentence didn't tear the room, it tightened it. You could feel the audience at home leaning forward, seeing exactly where the fault line ran and how it could cut both ways. The moderator tried to widen the space with a neutral question about balancing prudence and urgency, but the two women kept their focus like fighters who refused the clinch. Melania stayed on the risks, the way a phrase can be pulled out of context, how a misstep can light fires far from where it was spoken. She described the duty to guard calm when tempers are tender, to show restraint not because you are afraid, but because you are responsible. Her words painted leadership as a dam holding back floodwater. Across from her, Jasmine described neighborhoods that only get floodlights when sirens wail, where calm looks like being ignored, and restraint looks like a locked door. They didn't swap insults or names. They traded frameworks, each sentence a tool chosen for a very specific job. Melania's voice held the same temperature as before, but you could hear the steel wire braided through it, the conviction that order itself is a kind of mercy. Jasmine's voice held to the same calm, but the engine under it climbed the measured force of someone who has counted the cost of waiting and found it too high. The debate didn't sprawl. It narrowed, honed down to the thin edge where two truths refused to cancel each other. The chamber became a lens, bringing the argument to a point bright enough to sting. The room's sounds grew louder in the mix because nobody dared fill the quiet with filler. Water touched glass like tapping china paper, whispered a chair leg dragged the length of a single breath. Melania reminded the panel that leaders are clocks as well as compasses, that timing can be the difference between remedy and riot. Jasmine answered that justice has a shelf life and that delay can curdle into damage no speech can later clean. The moderator's eyes moved between them, counting beats, making sure the current ran hot but didn't arc. What made it electric was not outrage but precision, two philosophies sparring without breaking formation. Melania gave the country a picture of disciplined hands, steady words, clipped a belief that tone can preserve lives you'll never meet. Jasmine gave the country a picture of duty, spine straight, eyes bright, a belief that voice can reach lives the rules won't touch in time. Neither woman flinched, and the room matched them, holding the line between passion and chaos like a wire strung tight. The gavel didn't need to bang. The discipline in the air did the work. When the moderator signaled the close of the round, no one exhaled fully. The tension had been shaped, not spent. The argument sat on the desks like paired instruments, still vibrating, neither claiming victory, neither giving ground. Cameras held pens, paused the nation's pulse a half step faster than before. Nothing broke and nothing bent, and somehow that restraint made the whole thing feel even sharper. The room stayed perfectly upright, the silence humming like a live wire waiting for its next touch. The round had closed like a fist unclenching, but the pulse it left behind refused to fade. Chairs slid back, pens found grooves, cameras stared without blinking. The moderator scanned the dais, hoping a question might rise and rescue him. It did not. The energy didn't drop. It compressed like a storm, choosing to circle instead of break. Everyone waited for someone else to move first. He invited questions twice the second time, with a thread of hope woven into professional calm. No hands rose. Pages shuffled just to hide trembling, and a few nameplates gleamed against the pressure. The red tally lights watched like small, patient eyes. It felt like a railed ledge, safe to breathe, too high to look down. A clock ticked beyond the set, counting a beat nobody wanted to claim. Melania adjusted a sheet of paper so its edge lined perfectly with the table, then lifted her face to the room. When she spoke, the words didn't swell. They settled. Resilience has many languages. The line landed like a soft weight, steady enough to stop a slide. She did not decorate it, did not chase it with proof or plea. Her posture did that work for her, the poised geometry of someone who believes endurance can be fluent without being loud. The microphones hummed, and the sentence kept humming with them. Melania's gaze held the center camera for a beat, and then returned to the moderator as if she had just placed a stone where the river ran fastest. The staffers did not move. People who had come for fireworks found themselves watching a wick burn clean. Discipline, not drama, filled the room, and even that felt like a risk. Jasmine answered without lifting her folder, her hands still flat, her voice a clear line cut through velvet. And so does power. It was only 5 words, yet the echo behaved like a longer speech, carrying edge and consequence down the row of empty questions. She left the rest unsaid, and what was unsaid did not feel like retreat. It felt like proof. Her eyes stayed on the dais, not the lens, as if to remind the record that this was a conversation with duty before it was a performance for screens. The 2 sentences stood across from each other like pillars at a narrow gate, parallel, opposite, equally load-bearing. Resilience has many languages, and so does power. The chamber measured the distance between them the way a surgeon measures a cut. In the back row, a staff attorney pressed a thumb to a pulse point and felt his heartbeat answer to both. No one laughed, no one sighed, and no one wanted to be the first to soften what was sharp. A long beat stretched until it had its own weather. Every tiny sound magnified the slip of a cuff against wood, the whisper of a page turning the breath that barely cleared a throat. The moderator folded his hands to keep them from narrating his nerves. He could feel the fight still happening, but it was happening under glass, all the force sealed and none of the shrapnel. The room had learned the shape of a duel without shouting, and now it leaned in to watch the edges hold. Melania kept still as a portrait, but you could sense calculation, like a second pulse, steady and exact. Her line had claimed the ground of patience and form. She would not move from it. Jasmine's stillness answered in kind, the composure of someone who knows that presence itself can be a pressure point. The exchange no longer needed volume. It had gravity. The argument was not over. It had simply found a tighter orbit. The moderator cleared his throat, not a cue, not a verdict, just the sound a human makes when the air gets thin. He thanked both witnesses for their clarity and discipline, and the words felt true if too small. Pens returned to paper, not to write but to concentrate. No one had asked a question, and yet the record had filled with answers. The silence did not break. It held bright and dangerous like a wire singing between 2 anchors for now. The silence still hummed like a live wire. In the control room, a different crisis clicked into focus. The young technician sat with one hand on the fader and the other on the talkback, eyes flicking between meters and cameras, idling in the dark. The studio lights were down, but the boards glowed green ladders of sound, tiny storms climbing and falling. On the far right of the panel, a small amber dot burned under a label that read Axon. He leaned closer, headphones half on the world, shrinking to a thin hiss and a heartbeat. The lenses might have blinked off, but the audio plant was still wide awake. He was new enough to be nervous and trained enough to know why. During breaks, the record bus should sleep, IFB should murmur, and labs should be quiet unless someone calls for a check. He soloed the suspect channel and heard it breathcloth, the soft gravity of a room trying to behave. Then a faded afterimage of words, not full quotes, just the curve of speech brushing the noise floor. He looked up at the program feed. Black slate countdown paused, nothing moving. The amber light didn't care. It kept its steady V. He scanned the patch bay and saw the route Podium Labs feeding an auxiliary path that was still live to ISO record. It wasn't a trap. It was a missed step, the kind that hides in labels and muscle memory. He hovered the cursor over the software mute, then stopped and dropped his hand to the physical switch. Software could lie or lag. Plastic and metal are honest. He heard the supervisor's old rule in his head: protect the brake like it's air. He glanced at the policy binder, pages flagged from training he barely finished last week. For 2 seconds, the room split in his mind into two futures. In one, he lets it ride, cuts a clip, and becomes the first to hear what was never meant for the show. In the other, he makes it clean, and the story remains the story the country actually watched. His thumb twitched toward the record bookmark. Curiosity is a loud drum when a secret is breathing in your ear. He felt the heat of the screens, the static prickle of too much electricity. He set the headphones down and drew a breath to the bottom of his ribs. His finger found the tiny black rocker under the amber eye. The switch was small, the kind that doesn't get headlines, the kind that belongs to people who keep disasters from having names. He pressed. Click. The light went dark, and on the meter, the green bars fell like a curtain. He killed the slate feed on the ISO chain for good measure, then wrote 3 words in the ops log: AUXL, disabled. The room exhaled in his chest and his hands stopped shaking. He sat back and listened to the kind of silence that matters, not the absence of sound, but the presence of choice. Because he had shut it down, there would be no backroom leak, no shadow file to be sliced and served without context. If anything left this building, it would be the words spoken under lights with names and faces and time code attached. The country wouldn't be dragged into a fight about microphones. It would have to reckon with the ideas that took the stage. No gotcha, no midnight drop, just what everyone had already seen, hard and plain. He wasn't saving anyone from their own sentences. He was saving the shape of the debate from turning into a scavenger hunt. He wasn't hiding truth. He was refusing to decorate it with stolen angles. The point of the job, he reminded himself, wasn't to be important. It was to keep the signal honest. The best operators are ghosts who leave clean tracks. He swiveled once, checked the Dante map, and confirmed the route was cold. The building's pulse slowed by a notch. He checked the clock in the rundown. 2 minutes to stand by. In the glass beyond the studio held its pose desk, squared nameplates, straight tension, parked like a car with the engine on. Down here, the boards waited in a balanced quiet, ready to wake when the red tally came back. He watched the empty meters and thought of a simple thing, dressed like a rule: the truth hits hardest when you say it in the open. No hidden knives, no secret tapes, just the words you own. He placed the headphones back on the hook and straightened the edges of his notes. Small rituals to steady the hands that make live television look easy. Above the rack, the clock flipped toward the next minute, and the intercom crackled with the floor manager's count. He rolled his shoulders, ready to lift the faders only where they belonged. What mattered next would happen under lights, not in shadows, and upstairs the air was already leaning forward. That live wire finally found its next touch. The moderator straightened his papers and invited closing remarks. Voice steady, but eyes carrying the weight of everything that had just passed, and everything that could still break if a breath went wrong. The room leaned forward, as if one breath could tip the table, as if posture itself were part of the vote. Cameras settled into their stair tally lights, burning like coals waiting for a boot step, the lenses holding still so the country wouldn't. Both women held the pose, ready to set their final markers in the sand, ready to be quoted exactly as they meant it. He invited them to speak one last time, and the stillness answered before either of them did. Melania spoke first, the timing exact, each syllable placed like a stone in water that refuses to ripple. I choose to keep the peace. No flourish followed. She let the sentence do the work, and it did, calming the surface while tightening everything beneath, like a belt pulled one hole closer. Her hands stayed folded, the posture of someone who believes quiet can stop a slide, and that neat edges can keep chaos from finding a grip. The phrase painted her creed in clean lines: hold the line cool, the heat protect the room from itself, even if it means swallowing sparks. It asked for nothing in return. No applause, known and only room to stand where restraint is the strategy. Jasmine waited a heartbeat, then lifted her gaze not to the lens, but to the oath pinned inside her chest where it could not be edited. I choose to keep the oath. The words didn't rise. They rooted, reaching down into all the promises that pulled her here, and all the names that wouldn't fit on the Chiron. She kept her voice even because even can carry farther than loud when the ground is listening, and the consequences keep receipts. You could feel the room measure the distance between peace and oath, and realize it wasn't a hallway, but a knife edge that cut clean. In that instant, the red thread between promise and practice pulled tight enough to sing. The moderator nodded once, grateful and wary, as the two lines stood beside each other, like twin pillars at a narrow gate. Nobody won and nobody lost. Both statements carried the weight of a life spent paying different kinds of costs and defending different kinds of people. Staffers didn't stir as if movement might smear the ink before it dried and turn clarity into mess. Cameras held the frame, capturing a still life of resolve instead of a meltdown, because sometimes stillness is the loudest broadcast. The gavel's tap announced adjournment for the day, but the echo sounded like a heartbeat refusing to slow inside a chest that knows the fight isn't finished. What mattered was that both could stand in the same frame without blinking, and that the country saw it. As chairs scraped, they met at the edge of the table close enough to trade air, not headlines, the place where stagecraft turns back into people. Melania leaned in just far enough that courtesy could still claim the space, and the microphones couldn't. I have heard what you said. The line was quiet, unadorned, something offered rather than conceded, like placing a small stone on a grave you promised to visit. Jasmine's reply came the same way, level and direct, like a hand steadying a picture on a wall. I have heard you. The air between them didn't warm, but it steadied the way a bridge steadies after the last bolt is tightened. No handshake followed, no photo, no staged truce. The moment didn't ask for props and refused the easy exit. They stepped apart by inches, carrying their sentences like emblems that didn't need polishing and wouldn't fit in each other's pockets. Around them, the set exhaled cables, settling lights warming the chamber, reclaiming its ordinary air that always feels thinner after truth has been spoken. What remained was recognition, not agreement, the clean click of two truths acknowledging they share the same room and will likely meet again. The scene held there taut and wordless before the doors opened to release the day, and the cameras blinked to black. As the gavel's echo thinned, the country did not look away. The conversation detonated without a leak, which made it feel cleaner and somehow more dangerous. Newsrooms built specials from the official broadcast, only replays slowed to catch breath and posture instead of scandal. Group chats lit up with screenshots of two lines set side by side. I choose to keep the peace, and I choose to keep the oath, as if they were chess openings. Commentators kept waiting for a backroom bombshell that never came, and the absence of a hidden clip became the point. If the fight was going to happen, it would happen in the open, and people were ready to throw ideas, not grenades. In classrooms the next morning, teachers wrote the same sentence across whiteboards from Tulsa to Tacoma. When is silence complicity? A civics teacher in a crowded public high school framed the board with two columns, restraint and responsibility, then handed out index cards labeled with moments students actually see. A quiet kid in the back talked about bullying that looks like jokes and how everyone learned to stare at shoes. Another kid described a landlord's courtesy reminder that sounded like pressure and how the hallway went mute. The teacher kept time on a kitchen timer, forcing answers to fit inside 1 minute precision instead of volume, clarity instead of heat. Two towns over a debate coach staged a drill called mirror lines. Each side had to argue the opposite of its instinct. One team defended strength is not loud. The other argued kindness is not silence in the face of injustice. Voices stayed low because the rules demanded it, and that constraint made every word land hard. When a student slipped into swagger, the coach tapped the desk and said, "Less thunder, more lightning." By the bell, kids could name the difference between patience and abdication without rolling their eyes. The drill ended with a single scored question. When is silence complicity? By Sunday, pulpits turned into balancing beams. A pastor opened with "strength is not loud," then read letters from congregants who had spent years being told to be grateful for calm while their roofs leaked. A rabbi walked through the Sabbath as an act of restraint, then asked where rest becomes retreat when harm is right in front of you. An imam collected the room with a verse about mercy, then asked out loud whether mercy can include telling hard truth at the right volume. After the benediction circles formed at coffee tables, and people practiced saying two phrases without making them cancel each other: protect the peace and protect the oath. Around dining room tables, the discussion kept its charge without flipping any furniture. A grandmother said she had survived by lowering her voice and being twice as prepared as anyone else. A granddaughter said she had survived by refusing to swallow a joke that was a knife in a paper napkin. Someone printed the sentence on a post-it and stuck it beside the salt. When is silence complicity? The family built a list of tells. When be kind means don't embarrass me. When be respectful means don't reveal the bruise. The meal ended with a small pact: kindness would keep its seat at the table only if truth kept its seat beside it. Workplaces, too, rewrote their playbooks without waiting for a leaked memo to force it. In a Glass Tower's HR conference room, managers practiced a three-beat response for hard meetings. Name the concern, ask for evidence, set a time to act. In a warehouse, the safety lead held up a wrench and said, "This is what happens when a small sound becomes a big break," then pointed to the poster newly tacked to the wall. When is silence complicity? A nurse manager walked a night shift through two example charts and asked where professional tone became a blanket over a patient's pain. People began to notice how often "let's table this" meant "let's bury this," and they started checking themselves in real time. At a community forum inside a police precinct's multipurpose room, union reps, officers, and neighbors took turns at a microphone with a 90-second limit. An officer quoted, "A single wrong word can do harm," and a mother of three answered with, "1,000 days of silence do more harm than one word at the right time." The moderator held the countdown in the air like a fuse. Nobody got to grandstand, so nobody got to hide. They agreed on a simple protocol for bystanders: tap name route. Tap the issue to stop the slide name. What you see, route it to someone who can actually move it. The room left not with applause but with instructions. Editors met inside glass-walled conference rooms and chose austerity over adrenaline. They ran the transcript in the official footage and let the quotes carry their own weight without B-roll of slow-motion eye rolls or out-of-context sighs. A host said on air, "There is no clip to leak," and turned to a media ethicist who explained why that was a civic gain, not a ratings loss. Podcasters spliced two sentences into a beat. Strength is not loud under kindness, is not silence in the face of injustice, and asked listeners to leave voice notes finishing. When is silence complicity, with stories from their own jobs? Callers didn't yell, they delivered field reports. Universities built pop-up symposia titled Open Signal and packed them with students who usually avoid panels like the flu. A law professor diagrammed the hearing like a case: duty to speak, duty to refrain, duty to design a forum where either choice can be honorable. A journalism dean brought up the break, no leak, no shadow edit, and asked whether respecting the pause increased or decreased public trust. A student raised a hand and said trust rose because people saw the whole argument happen in daylight. They left with a rubric in their hands: harm, timing, forum, duty, 4 boxes to check before deciding whether to speak or stay still. On social feeds, the usual chaos reorganized itself around a question instead of a scandal. People filmed short clips holding a sheet of paper with "When is silence complicity" in thick marker, then told a 2-minute story and closed with where they drew their own line. A deaf creator signed both sentences, "I choose to keep the peace," and "I choose to keep the oath," and asked how communities define loud when sound isn't the medium. A librarian made a thread pairing novels where quiet saves lives with novels where quiet kills people, and the comments didn't devolve into the usual flame war. The algorithm didn't need a secret tape. It had a nation trading reasons. Coaches, chaplains, and principals printed cards and slid them into wallets and lockers. One side read, "When is silence complicity?" The other side held two scales: tone versus truth, order versus justice, with 3 questions under each. Is my quiet protecting people or sparing me? Will one precise sentence prevent a month of damage? Is the forum safe enough to carry heat without burning? In locker rooms and teacher lounges, people rehearsed lines that kept both dignity and urgency intact. The goal wasn't to win the meeting. It was to finish it with everyone's duty sharpened. In city halls and union halls, boards began meetings with a 1-minute ritual. The chair read, "Strength is not loud." The vice chair read, "Kindness is not silence in the face of injustice." And everyone answered together. When is silence complicity? A clerk tracked decisions that used the rubric out loud checking boxes, so responsibility didn't evaporate into good intentions. It felt ceremonial, almost corny, until the first time the ritual stopped a bad policy from sliding through on polite autopilot. The applause was quiet and lasted longer than clapping usually does. Families carried the debate into Monday chores. A father drafted an email to a coach about a slur on the sidelines, and his son stood at his shoulder and said, "Make it about the rule, not the rage." A caregiver called a supervisor and practiced a line 3 times, "I'm speaking up, because this is about safety, not blame." A teenager taped the question on a bedroom door. When is silence complicity? And underneath scribbled, "Ask before you knock." The house got louder in better ways and quieter in better places, which felt like progress disguised as ordinary life. The lesson that rose out of the noise was stubbornly simple and took people by surprise. Debate wasn't a cage match. It was a weight room, and the weight was responsibility. You didn't come to humiliate the other lifter. You came to push the bar 1 notch closer to the truth you could both live under. Win meant the policy got smarter, the hallway got safer. The patient got heard, the shop floor got fixed. In that frame, the 2 sentences that started the week became tool, not flags. Even the skeptics admitted that the absence of a leak had forced better habits. Without a covert clip to obsess over the country, replayed the official words until they had edges, then used those edges to cut arguments into cleaner shapes. Teachers kept assigning, "When is silence complicity?" because kids liked answering it more than they liked memorizing dates. Elders kept saying, "Strength is not loud," and still nodded when someone added, "But sometimes it needs a microphone." The fight stayed hot and stayed honest, and that combination felt new. By Friday, you could feel a rhythm settling in, as if the nation had found a beat it could keep without tripping over its own feet. Boardrooms and break rooms started catching themselves before they confused politeness with goodness or bravery with spectacle. The question sat on corkboards and dashboards and phone lock screens durable as duct tape. When is silence complicity? The answer was not a slogan. It changed with risk and role and room, and people learned to show their math. The action was not to shout more. It was to aim better. The week ended the way it began, with 2 ideas standing side by side, and the space between them finely drawn. People stopped asking who won the hearing and started asking what they owed each other in the next one. They learned to pass a microphone like a responsibility, not a weapon. They learned that debate is not to win, but to raise responsibility, and the proof was everywhere quieter. Streets, sharper meetings, fewer excuses. No leak had been needed. The truth had been said out loud, and the country decided to practice hearing it. The public conversation was burning bright. The next front opened in classrooms, newsrooms, and committee rooms. At the city's journalism school, a banner stretched over the main hall, "Ethics of the Break." Professors rolled cameras to the walls and filled the screen with the official hearing time code stamped in the corner like a heartbeat. No leaked audio, no whisper clips, only what the country had already seen and heard under lights. A media law chair posed the first question with surgical calm: when the tally lights go dark, what duty remains? The room tightened because everyone knew a break is not a blackout. It's a space you either guard or exploit. They began with anatomy before opinion, treating the break like a system, not a feeling. A veteran producer mapped the signal chain from lav mics to ISO record marking with neon tape, the small failure points that can split trust in half. A sound engineer lifted a battered XLR and said, "This is the wire between trust and spectacle," and even the back row went still. A student editor confessed the pull of curiosity when an amber diode refuses to die, and the head of standards explained why curiosity is not a defense. A public editor asked whether restraint shows loyalty to the audience or only loyalty to the process, and a dozen pens started moving. It felt less like a lecture and more like a lab where precision, not adrenaline, saves the experiment. To make the stakes real, the faculty ran a live drill that copied the hearing frame by frame. Students took roles: floor manager, A1, switcher, anchor counsel, and ombuds, and the hall snapped into a working studio. A scripted panel rolled. The moderator called recess. Routes on the wall display glowed like a storm map over a city. The technician noticed a stray AUX path still feeding an ISO deck and had to decide in 3 seconds whether to cut or capture. The anchor practiced keeping hands still while the lens slept, and the ombuds rehearsed the language for documenting a downstate without sounding like a cop. The drill ended with a debrief that felt like a verdict delivered to adults. Rules followed not as shackles, but as rails you can trust at speed. The cohort drafted a one-page code powered down record buses by default during recess. Log handoffs, signal break status both visually and verbally. Keep private channels private unless a safety trigger fires. A second page laid out a rubric for editors, harm timing form duty, that must be checked before publishing anything captured off-air. Another page proposed color cues in control rooms so quiet becomes unmistakable even when the room is loud. A third page standardized the phrase clear to air, requiring 2 voices and 2 signatures, before the red lights return. When the dean countersigned the packet, a dozen shoulders dropped the same half-inch. Across town, community organizers built a workshop with a blunt name that drew a line the Jasmine Melania exercise. The brief was strict and simple, and the room smelled like coffee and dry markers as people paired off. Right on the same public question, from 2 positions, one grounded in silence as ritual, the other grounded in speaking out as duty. Sheets were printed with split columns so both arguments could stand side by side without shouting across the paper. Facilitators required steel manning present the other side's best case before you present your own. No straw, no cheap shots. Phones went into lock pouches because speed is the enemy of depth and the friend of performance. The first round used problems people actually live with, not hypotheticals no one owns. A teacher described the half second before stopping a joke aimed at a student who already eats lunch alone. A nurse weighed waking a supervisor at 3 a.m. because a chart looked wrong and the alarms were quiet. A neighbor considered recording a traffic stop on a dark block while the pulse hammered like a drum. In the left column, restraint prevented collateral harm. In the right column, voice prevented invisible harm that accumulates in silence. When pages went up on the wall, the seam where 2 honest duties collide became visible to everyone. Facilitators walked the rows with colored stickers and a rule that changed the mood reward sentences that respect the opponent's moral center without surrendering your own. Blue marked lines that made a clean distinction. Red marked lines that smuggled contempt. Green marked lines that improved after revision. Participants discovered how decency can become a blanket and how urgency can become a blowtorch, and they learned to tell the difference by the heat each one throws. The strongest drafts raise both columns at once, like a bridge taking weight from both shores. Debate is not to win, but to raise responsibility, a facilitator wrote in thick marker along the top. People looked tired and proud at the same time. The second round added timing because timing is where most decisions fail. Each table carried a dial from whisper to siren, and teams had to set a level for every key sentence in both columns. A what if card forced context. What if children are present? What if translation lags? What if the form is hostile or under-moderated? People learned that the right sentence at the wrong level can make a clean truth look like a planned mess. They closed by reading the 2 strongest paragraphs aloud and naming where the edge lived and how they would guard it. Nobody clapped. They exhaled, which felt more honest than applause. Meanwhile, committees on the Hill took up something unflashy and essential that cameras usually ignore. Staff counsel from both parties sat with broadcast chiefs and sergeants at arms to draw a clean line between on-air duty and off-air care. The draft was not a gag order, it was a seatbelt. Microphones would power down automatically on recess, with a physical flag raised on the dais so anyone with eyes could confirm status. A clock would run visibly for the public and the panel, so no one mistook a pause for a stunt. The point was to protect dignity without bearing accountability under jargon. The procedure added a break marshal, a neutral officer trained to mind the line, as if the line were a door that must not drift. The marshal's job was boring on purpose, verify downstate, on audio verify camera status, verify door control, then log the moment with a timestamp that can survive court. A clear-to-air ritual required 2 signatures to restart, one from the chair's clerk and one from control. A no-clip covenant reminded staff and vendors that off-air capture during designated recess is a breach, not a scoop. Penalties were administrative, not theatrical, because the goal was discipline, not fear. In short, the recess became a designed space instead of an improvised risk. Debate over the rule was loud in the press gallery and careful in the room where the ink dries. Civil liberties groups asked whether the public loses crucial context when a recess is sealed too tightly by default. Press advocates asked whether a rigid system might bury misconduct under the technicality of a switch. The compromise was sunlight with lanes, which sounds simple until you build it in code and policy. There would be public logs of every recess audio and video health checks recorded as metadata and emergency exceptions when danger or felony triggers override the seal. Each exception would trigger an after-action review, so the rule learns and the trust grows. Out of those same conversations, a new phrase climbed onto syllabi and agendas, the resolution of debate. Here, resolution did not mean a vote, a slogan, or a tidy ending. It meant clarity, the ability to let meaning separate from noise. Professors borrowed language from optics because the picture makes it obvious. Two stars can smear into one blur when the lens is cheap. More light only makes the blur brighter. The fix isn't more light. The fix is better glass. In speech, the glass is made from definitions, context checks, time boxes, and the habit of paraphrasing the other side so well, they say, "Yes, that's what I mean." Practitioners began to write the parts into scripts where nerves usually take over. Before voices rise to find the brittle term that will break everything if it stays vague. Peace oath, safety restraint, or urgency. Require participants to declare intent up front, inform, persuade, compel, warn, or confess so the room knows which tool is on the table. Insert paraphrase checks at fixed intervals turning. You're twisting my words into, here is the summary I can endorse. Cap monologues with time not to muzzle passion, but to force precision when the stakes are high. Make the record legible enough that a newcomer can read the transcript and know what was meant, not just what was said. The visual realm joined in because people listen with their eyes when their ears are tired. Public broadcasters tested split-screen overlays that paired each claim with its reasons not as a versus graphic, but as a schematic. Captioners were given authority to add clarifying tags. Sarcasm quotation, hypothetical so, intent does not vanish in the scroll. Live streams added a discrete definition, tray keyed to hot words letting viewers tap for the meaning and use, rather than project their own. None of this lowered passion, it raised clarity. The goal was not to make arguments soft, it was to make them sharp without bleeding. In neighborhoods and nonprofits, the language moved from panels to postcards and from theory to front doors. Groups printed a pocket card that read on one side, "When is silence complicity?" On the other side sat three small tools: tap name root, the three breaths rule, and the window mirror test. Tap pauses the moment without shaming. Name states what is happening in plain terms. Route sends the issue to someone who can actually move it. The three breaths rule says, do not answer while your pulse is pounding in your ears. Breathe until words can land. The window mirror test asks whether you are looking out to protect others or looking in to protect your comfort. Street by street, people started catching themselves before mistaking quiet for goodness or volume for courage. Parent groups use the exercise to decide when to meet a principal privately and when to log a formal complaint that leaves a paper trail. Hospital teams use the card to decide when to page a supervisor and when to call a code without waiting for permission. Protest marshals use resolution of debate to write chants that name policy precisely so the message did not bleed into the slur an opponent hopes to amplify. Social workers use the dial metaphor from the workshop to set tone in rooms where grief and blame arrive together. Clarity became a discipline instead of a mood. None of this magic removed conflict because conflict is not a stain to scrub. It is weight to lift with form. The journalism seminar made sure breaks were honest pauses, not booby traps set for ratings. The Jasmine Melania exercise taught people to argue like adults without forcing a fake hug or a fake enemy. The safe recess procedure let hearings protect dignity without burying misconduct under the technicality of a switch. The resolution of debate gave language a higher grade lens, turning blur into lines you can actually follow. And society learned the hard but usable distinction. Sometimes you need silence, sometimes you need voice. And the work is knowing which one belongs now. From drills and rules, the argument found a spine you could hold. A week later, a thin book landed on cafe counters and campus kiosks with a title that felt like a dare. No whispers, no shouts. There was no author photo, no endorsements, no dust jacket, just a matte gray cover with two parallel lines crossing the middle, like tracks you could walk without meeting. Inside the first page carried a single sentence, set in clear type and centered like a bell. Strength is not loud. Turn the page and the second sentence faced you like a matched blade. I wasn't elected to whisper. There were no chapters, no footnotes, only blank pages meant for the reader's notes, margins as wide as a palm. The thing felt less like a book and more like gear. Students picked it up first because it fit inside a hoodie pocket and didn't act like homework. In lecture halls, they slid it under notebooks and used those blank pages to map arguments like routes through a city. One kid wrote tone along the top of the first half and truth along the top of the second, then practiced dialing each up and down without wrecking the engine. In debate club, they held the book in the air when a teammate strayed into performance and the glance was enough. Volume dropped, clarity rose. A graduation speaker taped the two sentences to the inside of a mortarboard because a message that fits under a cap is harder to forget. Even the quiet desks started taking ground. Politicians adopted it with the speed of people who recognize a tool that won't embarrass them on camera. A city council member kept the book on the dais and opened it whenever a hearing turned hot, holding it up like a neutral card the whole room had agreed to play by. A freshman senator under fire for a vote read, "Strength is not loud," before stepping to a microphone and then read, "I wasn't elected to whisper," before taking questions. Chiefs of staff copied the two lines onto briefing cards so their bosses could anchor both feet without sliding into slogans. It became a ritual as simple as a breath read, one read the other, then speak. The country didn't get softer, it got steadier. In boardrooms where money hums and worry keeps score, executives learned to treat the book like a torque wrench. A product team facing a recall used strength is not loud. To stop the instinct to spin then used, I wasn't elected to whisper. To tell customers the whole truth before the rumor mill did it for them. Marketing and legal, usually in opposite trenches, started drafting joint statements with both lines taped above the whiteboard like guardrails. A founder slid a copy across the table to a VC and said, "This is our comms policy," and the deal didn't die. It stabilized. Even quarterly calls wired for theater gained a new shape, less gloss, more grip. The floor price on honesty in business ticked up by a hair. Journalists, typically allergic to manifestos, let this one in because it didn't tell them what to think. It told them when to shut up and when to press. In morning meetings, showrunners opened with "Strength is not loud," to protect the pause that lets facts arrive intact. Before air anchors tapped, I wasn't elected to whisper, to remind themselves that soft pedaling is not the same as fairness. Producers used the margins to storyboard resolution of debate, plotting when to ask a definition, when to play a clip, and when to plant a follow-up that lands like a measured weight. On set, the book sat under a teleprompter like a paper ballast. Ratings didn't crash. Segments got cleaner. The streets didn't ignore it either, which is the real test for anything printed. Coaches carried copies to practice and made their captains read the first line before huddles and the second line before captains' meetings with officials. Paramedics tucked the book into rig pockets and quoted, "Strength is not loud," at scenes where shouting adds nothing but echo, then quoted, "I wasn't elected to whisper." At supervisors when staffing made safety a gamble. Union stewards kept stacks on folding tables outside break rooms and wrote phone numbers in the back covers so the chain of action didn't snap at the first excuse. It wasn't merch, it was kit. You could feel the city get a fraction more practical by noon. Crucially, the book never pretended to reconcile anything. It didn't say the two sentences were halves of one truth. It presented them as neighbors who share a fence and never trade houses. Not to reconcile the back flap read in the small type, but to remind these two ways of being stand side by side. Protesters held it up on courthouse steps, and counter-protesters held it too, which looked like a glitch until you remembered the point. The symbol wasn't permission to claim the other line. It was a demand to respect that it exists and carries weight. Two banners in the same frame, neither surrendering, neither claiming the other, is a fraud. That image stuck. Critics push back as they should when a thing gets too shiny. Some said it was a coffee table stunt, a mood board for people who like the smell of courage but not the mess. Others complain that condensing civic ethics to two sentences invites lazy thinking and cute merch drops. The response that held was simple. The book is not content, it's a frame. Frames don't do the painting. They hold it steady so brushstrokes can be judged without slipping off the wall. You don't clap for the frame. You use it, wear it out, and replace it when better craft arrives. Seminars built lesson plans around that discipline instead of around devotion. In Ethics of the Break workshops, the book kicked off drills where students had to hold both lines in their mouths without smudging either. Say them, the professor said, and the class did quietly like testing a bridge. Then came scenarios: a whistleblower, with thin proof; a mayor, with loud rumors; a hospital with one too few nurses per shift. For each case, the room had to assign which line owns the first minute and which line owns the second, and write the sentence that follows, both with clean grammar and clean conscience. There was sweat in that work. There were fewer hashtags. Families learned to make it domestic, which is where culture really changes, or doesn't. A parent taped the two lines to a fridge and told a teenager, "You get the first for a house rule, I get the second for safety. We will trade when we have to." A sister used "strength is not loud" to keep a reunion from falling apart at the first dumb story about politics, then used "I wasn't elected to whisper" to pull a cousin aside about a slur that needed to die. The book lived on end tables and nightstands, dog-eared not from theory, but from being grabbed mid-argument like a potholder. It took the heat and kept fingers from burning off. In courtrooms and committee rooms, the book's minimalism, smuggled in a larger shift resolution, mattered more than volume. A judge referred to the lines in a sentencing with the kind of neutrality that makes both sides listen, then explained timing as the hinge that decides which duty leads. A hearing chair opened with the first line and closed with the second, not as theater, but as a structure everyone had pre-agreed to. Lobbyists rolled their eyes in private and then handed clients copies in public because it made negotiations less volatile and more predictable. Rules you can count on, beat vibes you can't 9 times out of 10. Schools hacked the format because that's what schools do when something works. A principal created a 2-line drill for teacher training practice de-escalation, with the first escalate to accountability with the second, and demonstrate the precise moment you switch. The quiet teacher who hates confrontation found a sentence that carried like a whistle without being a shout. The loud teacher who fills space found a way to put the room first without giving bad behavior the wheel. Hallways didn't turn to glass, but they stopped feeling like open microphones for the worst kid on any given day. The book didn't make heroes, it made form. Even art scenes forever suspicious of rules gave it a try. Spoken word nights started with a host holding the book and setting the room's temperature before the mic was open. Directors taped the lines to call boards and told actors, "This is how we take notes today." A muralist painted the 2 sentences on opposite walls of an underpass, then left the tunnel in the middle blank for new lines that changed with the season. Skate crews stenciled, "Strength is not loud," on pads, and "I wasn't elected to whisper" on decks, because both messages get you home with your teeth still in. Culture cheats death by stealing what works and moving on. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.